Climate change, a comprehensive overview of historical development, causes, and far-reaching consequences. Climate change is not just an environmental problem, but a profound challenge for all humanity and the complex fabric of our planet. It affects ecosystems, economies, social structures, and ultimately human survival. The realization that our climate is changing is not new. What is alarming today is the speed at which this change is occurring and the overwhelming evidence that human activity is the primary driver. To understand the magnitude of this phenomenon, we must first examine the long history of the Earth's climate. The Earth's climate has been in constant flux since its formation about 4.5 billion years ago. It has undergone extreme phases, from scorching hot periods, during which the Earth was almost uninhabitable, to deep ice ages, when large parts of the Earth's surface were covered by kilometers-thick ice sheets. Viewed on geological timescales, warm periods, interglacials, and cold periods, glacials, alternated rhythmically. These cycles are mainly explained by Milankovitch cycles, changes in the Earth's orbit and axial tilt that alter the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth. Volcanic eruptions, tectonic movements, and natural fluctuations in solar activity also influence the climate. A particularly relevant period is the last ice age, which began around 115,000 years ago and ended about 11,700 years ago. With the end of this ice age began the Holocene, a warm period during which human civilization developed. This comparatively stable climate enabled the development of agriculture, sedentary lifestyles, and complex societies. Over the millennia, the climate experienced smaller fluctuations, documented in historical sources, such as the medieval warm period, approximately 950 to 1250 AD, and the Little Ice Age, approximately 1300 to 1850 AD. These changes influenced harvests, population movements, and political developments. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the mid-18th century, humans have burned fossil fuels on an unprecedented scale. Coal, oil, and natural gas became the foundation of industry, transportation, and energy production. At the same time, the global population grew rapidly, increasing the demand for resources. Burning fossil fuels releases large amounts of carbon dioxide, CO2, a gas that naturally occurs in the atmosphere and is the main driver of the so-called greenhouse effect. Besides CO2, methane, CH4, nitrous oxide, N2O, and fluorinated gases are significant greenhouse gases. They originate from agriculture, livestock farming, waste management, industrial processes, and the use of refrigerants. The greenhouse effect itself is a natural phenomenon that makes life on Earth possible by trapping the sun's heat. The problem is that the massive increase in greenhouse gas concentrations strengthens this insulating layer, causing the Earth to overheat. The anthropogenic rise in CO2 concentration is unprecedented. From about 280 parts per million, ppm, before the Industrial Revolution, the level has risen to over 420 ppm by 2023. This change occurred in a fraction of the time it usually takes for the climate to shift naturally. Global warming leads to a series of complex and often interconnected changes. The average global temperature has risen about 1.2 degrees Celsius since the late 19th century. The Arctic is warming especially rapidly. Arctic amplification, drastically altering ecosystems and ice coverage. Melting glaciers and ice sheets, along with the thermal expansion of oceans, cause a global rise in sea levels. Coastal regions worldwide are increasingly threatened, potentially forcing millions to relocate. Droughts and heavy rainfall events are becoming more frequent and intense, impacting water supplies and agriculture, threatening food security. Many plant and animal species cannot adapt quickly enough to the changing conditions. Biodiversity losses and species extinctions increase, threatening ecosystem stability. Extreme weather events cause damage to infrastructure, homes, and livelihoods. Health risks from heat waves and the spread of diseases are rising. Additionally, resource shortages, migration, and conflicts may increase. On the international level, the 2015 Paris Agreement marked a milestone. It aims to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. Achieving this requires comprehensive decarbonization, i.e., transitioning to low or zero emission technologies, sustainable land use, and protection of natural carbon sinks like forests and peatlands. However, numerous obstacles exist. Many industries and states remain heavily dependent on fossil fuels. Developing countries demand support as they often suffer most from climate impacts while having contributed least to the causes. Differing national priorities and geopolitical tensions complicate a unified global strategy. Besides political and economic measures, individual behavior and societal values also play a role. Conscious consumption, energy saving, sustainable mobility, and diets can reduce personal carbon footprints. Education fosters climate awareness and motivates social engagement. Innovations such as renewable energies, solar, wind, hydrogen, electromobility, circular economy, and carbon capture technologies form technological building blocks for a climate-friendly future. Climate change is a complex, global phenomenon with profound impacts on nature, society, and the economy. Its historical development shows that the Earth's climate has always been in flux, but today's scale and speed of warming due to human activities are unprecedented. The challenges require collective, swift, and determined action at all levels: global, national, local, and individual. Only then can global warming be limited and a livable future for coming generations secured. Although the scientific evidence for human-caused climate change has been overwhelming for decades and the consequences increasingly visible, many societies and individuals find it difficult to fundamentally change their behavior. This paradox has many psychological, social, and economic causes. Many people face an internal conflict. They are aware of the threat, but do not want to give up their accustomed lifestyles and comforts. This unpleasant feeling of cognitive dissonance is often alleviated through denial, trivialization, or postponement. Climate change appears abstract and distant, reducing urgency. Another crucial factor is so-called temporal discounting, the human tendency to value immediate rewards and dangers more than long-term or distant risks. Climate change mostly unfolds in the future and affects people often in other countries or social groups. For example, a consumer in Central Europe feels less affected by rising sea levels in Bangladesh. The impacts of CO2 emissions released today often only become apparent decades later. This distance reduces urgency and motivation to act. People strongly adapt their behavior to that of their social environment. If sustainable behavior is not socially recognized or is seen as inconvenient, consistent action is difficult. Studies show that social norms and the desire to belong strongly influence behavior. For example, knowing that neighbors save energy can motivate change. Conversely, perceiving that nobody really changes can lead to resignation. This explains why social movements and visible role models are so important to promote change. Climate change is also a matter of power and conflicting interests. Fossil fuel companies have long influenced politics and media to delay or dilute climate protection measures. Jobs, economic growth, and short-term profits often conflict with long-term environmental protection. Individuals are often trapped in systems that make sustainable alternatives difficult, such as poorly developed public transport or higher prices for ecological products. Political decisions reflect these conflicts and are frequently shaped by lobbying. The scale and complexity of climate change can be paralyzing. This feeling of powerlessness arises because individual actions are often seen as insignificant against global forces. Psychologists emphasize that climate change is perceived as an overwhelming problem with unclear solutions, a significant barrier to personal engagement. The flood of information, coupled with contradictory or misleading messages, makes it difficult to form a clear stance. Scientific findings are often communicated in shortened, sensationalist forms, causing confusion. Additionally, deliberate disinformation campaigns and so-called fake news fuel doubts about the reality or urgency of climate change. This is especially problematic on social media, where emotional and polarizing content gains high reach. The reasons for delayed climate protection and hesitant behavioral change are diverse and deeply rooted. Psychological defense mechanisms, the abstract and complex nature of the problem, social and economic constraints, and targeted disinformation combine to create a kind of collective denial. Overcoming these barriers requires emotional appeal that conveys not only facts, but also positive visions and tangible opportunities for action, social cohesion through groups and role models, structural changes through political and economic frameworks, and education and transparent communication. Only when all these levels work together can societal transformation succeed in effectively addressing climate change.